Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Clark, and I'm the Director of Choral Activities at Harvard University. On behalf of the Harvard Choruses and First Church in Cambridge, we welcome you to tonight's discussion, American Jezebel, the story of Anne Hutchinson in words and music, presented in anticipation of the March 1st world premiere of James Kallembach's opera, American Jezebel, commissioned and presented by the Harvard Choruses. First Church Cambridge, along with First Parish in Cambridge, here in Harvard Square, can both claim through its lineage to be the ancestral congregations where the story we will explore and took place 400 years ago. So we'll begin with questions tonight that I'll ask the panelists. These questions were written and submitted by our own students from the chorus performing the opera. And at the end of our time together, we'll take as many questions from the audience as we can, but not before we'll hear a very short excerpt from the opera performed by the soprano Sarah Joyce Cooper, who is singing the role of Anne Hutchinson. We have an hour tonight to draw upon our guests' expertise, acquired in some cases over decades of study and research. So we'll do our best to set the stage for our performance in this time together. It's now my honor to introduce our three distinguished guests, beginning with Eve LaPlante. As I introduce Eve, I'm going to share actually the cover of her wonderful book entitled American Jezebel. And yeah, I should be able to see it there. Eve LaPlante is an award-winning author and historian whose works explore the lives of pioneering women in American history. Her books include American Jezebel, and Eve is actually a direct descendant of Anne Hutchinson. She brings a deeply researched and personal perspective to early American history in this way, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and other major publications, and she's also an alum of our very own Harvard Graduate School of Education. We're also joined tonight by Dr. James Kallembach, the librettist and composer of our opera. James is a composer and conductor known for his evocative choral and vocal works that often blend historical narratives with contemporary expression. He serves as the director of choral activities at the University of Chicago, where he leads acclaimed vocal ensembles, including the music program at the historic Rockefeller Chapel. His compositions showcase his deep engagement with history and literature, and his music has been performed by many leading choirs and ensembles around the world. And last but not least, Dr. Francis J. Bremer is a leading historian of Puritanism and the professor emeritus of history at Millersville University of Pennsylvania. He has authored numerous books on the Puritans, including John Winthrop, America's Forgotten Founding Father, and One Small Candle, The Plymouth Puritans in the Beginning of New England. A recognized authority on early American history, Professor Bremer has served as an advisor for historical sites and documentary projects, and his work provides a nuanced perspective on the religious, political, and social dynamics in the Puritan era. So I think we should start with Eve, because in many ways it was her book that got things rolling with this opera project. And again, these are questions from our very own students. And I thought I might begin by selecting this one, which is to simply ask about Anne Hutchinson. Why is Anne Hutchinson the only woman who co-founded an American state so relatively unknown? Why is she not more famous? And maybe what are some of the biggest misconceptions that those of us that know about this history might have about Anne Hutchinson?
Thank you, Andrew. I think that a very good way to sum up Anne Hutchinson's contribution is to use the words of a scholar named Amy Schrager Lang, who said that as a woman, Anne Hutchinson has been pictured as opposing the founding fathers, indeed opposing the very idea of America. And in a single sentence, Lang says, the problem of Anne Hutchinson is the problem of the public woman. That is, a woman with any kind of public power or voice, because the problem for her was that she was female. Had she been male, she would have become a minister, and all of the activities she engaged in would have been perfectly acceptable. But it was ultimately comes down, in my view, to gender. As far as why she's not better known, you can compare her post-banishment relationship with many men who were banished by Winthrop and the general court. And just to take one example of Roger Williams, he maintained a very close epistolary relationship with Winthrop and worked with him. And John Wheelwright, who was Anne's brother-in-law, also did the same and even asked to be allowed to come back to Massachusetts. So whereas she was considered basically an ally of Satan and sort of not only banished, but also excommunicated from the church. So it was a very different response to a woman.
Yeah.
I don't know, did you have another part to the
No,
question?
thank you so much. That's a wonderful answer and a great way to get us started. So I'd like to now turn to James, and this is a two-part question from our students. The first is maybe the obvious one. Why did you choose to write this opera and this particular story, this specific time and place with these characters? And related to that, the opera incorporates some fictional characters, and would love to hear a little bit about that as well. Why did you feel that they were important to include? How did you approach them, as well as the historical figures? So a two-part question for you there, James.
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of things, I'll be explaining tonight why, why did you have to make stuff up? Why did you change things? Because that's, what I guess sort of in the end was my job to try to create a narrative to this story. Um, so I think it was through a radio news story that I came across Eve LaPlante's book. And then I just recently set some poetry of Bradstreet, and so that sort of like had me in that mind frame, I guess. And so then when I came across this book, it just sort of piqued my interest. And when I read it, I have to say that it's the dramatic presentation and the clear laying out of critical themes of this controversy and of Anne's life that was really inspiring to the idea that this would be um, a good theater production. It would be a good opera. And, there is something sort of attractive about the idea. The first image that came to my mind are, you know, people all dressed in black moving around these big hewn timbers, on stage, which sounds like a neat thing to see. And then as I started to work with the libretto, and this sort of goes to the second part of the question, um, and so I'm gonna have to tell a really important thing that I expected to say tonight first from the very get-go, is that when we read history and we see Anne Hutchinson being banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it makes us angry as modern people, right? And it makes us, and we view it as tragic, but in a sort of slow, not cathartic sense. And on stage and in theater, I feel like to me, this controversy, to make it palpable to people, there had to be a real life consequence to the actions that people were taking at the time. And so that's where the sort of reverse ingenue uh, characters of Mary and Tom come out. So ingenue in musical theater is usually like the cutesy couple that have problems, but everyone just sort of winks and nods and says, "Oh, well, they'll be fine. They're kids. It's great." But in this case, because it's a tragedy, they're anti-ingenue, so it isn't great. Their problems become very tragic, and eventually, Mary cannot find a good connection within her community, and that ends in a tragic loss. So that's where the fictional characters come into play. The fact is that the story I tell about Anne is a work of fiction. I mean, it does not follow the exact, timeline or the exact events, the way they transpired. But of course, that would probably not be a very good opera, or one that I would be bad at writing, I guess I should say. And hopefully that answered the question. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And you use the word controversy and raise this theological debate and conflict at the time. And one of our singers, Thomas King from the Collegium Musicum, our mixed choir, wrote this question that I'll pose to you, Francis. He writes, can you summarize the antinomian controversy in 2 minutes? Or
No.
No.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll probably go a little bit more than 2 minutes on this. I think it is an important controversy. I think it reveals a lot about certain aspects of Massachusetts society. First of all, to understand this, we have to understand the fact that people at the time did not make any real distinction between the sacred and the secular. They believed that the natural and the supernatural worlds were intertwined, that things that happen in the natural world often had supernatural causes. They also believed that everything pointed back to God, and that there was one truth which people had to struggle to find. Now, a number of people, the Puritans belong to that wing of the Protestant Reformation that in essence believes that in the priesthood of all believers. And Puritans were stronger than most, and particularly actually the Plymouth Puritans, in saying that any individual believer could, in reading scripture, be inspired by the Holy Spirit to understand what the truth was, and that they were under an obligation to share that truth. And as a result, women were supposed to read the Bible. They were supposed to look for this inspiration. They could share their inspiration with others. The problem with all of this is that how do you distinguish what is the inspiration of the Spirit from your own, perhaps erroneous understanding of what the scripture is actually saying? And can you go beyond the scripture and actually claim that, which eventually will happen with Quakers, that while the scripture is the word of God, God can also speak to you directly outside of the scriptures. And these are some of the issues that get wrapped up in the antinomian controversy, which ultimately is a controversy over where the society sets the boundaries as to what is acceptable behavior and practice and what is unacceptable, what is beyond the pale. And I think a lot of this is brought out very well in the libretto that James has written.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to come back to Eve. This is a question from a student who's with us tonight, James Ganun, who's a fourth-year student in the Harvard Glee Club. And the question is this, maybe a two-part question from James. How did Puritan conceptions of work inform the faith works debate at the heart of the conflict? And was the establishment worried that emphasizing faith would cause people to lapse in their work, which was so necessary for survival? I think we've been trying to explore and reflect upon, as we learn the opera, this tension between faith and works. And want to ask you, Eve, how you see that in terms of the Puritans' perspective and how that impacted their daily lives.
Yeah. Well, I think this goes very well with what Frank was talking about. I think that the crux of the conflict between the covenant of grace and the covenant of works was that she was maintaining the Calvinist notion of salvation coming not from people and their works, but only from God through grace. And at the time of the creation of this new colony that was so very important to maintain and unify for all the men of the general court, John Winthrop and many of the ministers and judges adopted a theology that enforced obedience in the colony. And she called that a covenant of works, as did some other ministers. And this was not acceptable Calvinism to believe the covenant of works. But to the leaders at the time, desperate to maintain this colony, they were basically telling people through the ministers in their sermons, if you only just follow the rules and the laws, then you can have assurance that you are elect and thus saved. So it was a theological conceit that was necessary in their view, but it was bad Calvinism, and she was going to point that out. I don't know if I quite answered all of the question, but if there's a part I missed, you could add that.
No. Absolutely. That's very very helpful. Thank you. This is a question, James, from Annika Christensen, who is a third-year student in the Radcliffe Choral Society, also a composer. And she asks, do you ever think of the irony that Puritans largely prohibited elaborate music and singing, and yet the story is being told through those means? Was there any intention behind that? And maybe a second part of the question that's quite interesting, I think, for all of us, is the extent to which the music that would have been going around Newtown 400 years ago, are there any nods or influences or Easter eggs in your opera that evoke the music of that particular time?
Yeah, most of the Easter eggs are actually don't have to do with the 17th century, but yeah, I love that question because, and I don't know if I have a good answer for it. The one about music and Puritanism. So I mean I remember, talking early on with a colleague about this, and they grew up in a some form of Calvinist church, and he told me about, someone would play a pitch on the pitch pipe, and then they would sing psalms in homophony, right? And there was no instruments allowed, and so on and so forth. And I think that wouldn't make for a great opera. But what I did do is I think there are clues that I did look to. I mean, there's also something to be said about like going into something historical and then romanticizing it and letting it open up in a way that's expressive to us today, right? I mean, I think that's obviously probably mostly what's going on here. But some of the clues that I did look for are I am a church musician, so I do psalmody, like, Anglican chant and this kind of stuff, and chants and things that I have some familiarity with. And then I have prior to this had some familiarity with the base psalm book, which are these sort of poorly, I hate saying it, but like poorly syntaxed and rhymed version of the Psalms, which I think were probably sung, to various tunes in churches, a cappella, of course, because instruments were allowed. Um, and when you read these, you start to get this like kind of like limerick rhyme gets embedded in your brain. You kind of get this embedded bad syntactical rhyming scheme and weird syntax and stuff. At any rate, so I think that that's sort of what I try to depict in some of the choral scenes, and I think that that was one thing. So that's that thing. Um, there's also the idea of of people just singing together in homophony, right? Like in at the same time, like a hymn would be sung. So that kind of I feel like that's not so much opera chorusy as it is like it sounds like church singing. And then lastly, I'd say that there is like an actual Easter egg in there, sort of, where so the green grows the laurels, which is a broadside, a British broadside, but it's a broadside that was found in the New Jersey Pine Barrens in the Great Depression by a very famous ethnomusicologist, George, and blanking on his name, but it doesn't matter. The point is that I listened to a bunch of these, and you hear these people sing them, and they sound kind of like chant-like and sort of, and they're very modal, right? So you find this guy who's had this, supposedly passed down for generations, and the words have become all bastardized, but the fact is that the tune still sounds eerily like a modal medieval tune,
Hmm.
which is really kind of neat. And so that I definitely tried to emulate that in that particular movement. Other than that, obviously it's my own music. But I love that question. Oh, it also allows, of course, for this great metaphor with it in the Grove scene, where Mary and Tom play a different kind of Adam and Eve, an American Adam and Eve, where Tom is playing the fife, right? He's playing his flute. This is scandalous, How dare you play a flute? It's people don't do that in polite company. But and I kind of see them as, will this couple be tempted to live modern lives and just leave the colony and live the way they want to, or not? So there's sort of represent us, I guess. So those are the ways I feel like, music and Puritanism are reflected.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just responding to a good question in the Q&A about Easter eggs. So as musicians, sometimes we'll discover that a composer has hidden maybe a quote or a reference that would take some familiarity or past knowledge or I don't know, in insider intel to be able to point out when studying a work or when hearing a work. And you see these things sometimes around paintings as well, right? So yeah,
Andrew,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I make a point that I think is very interesting? I don't know how much James intended it, but I find it fascinating that in the way this is presented, that it reinforces a lot of what I've said and written about lay empowerment, because here you have a controversy which is focusing on a significant theological issue, and the two protagonists are lay people. There are no clergy involved in the actual presentation of the opera. And I think that's interesting, because one could easily have done it by looking at the church trial, which does involve many more clergy, but even in the civil trial, there are clergy involved. But I mean, the fact that these are two lay people speaks to how in this society, lay people are encouraged to think about their faith and to ask deep questions about it.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, for that. Yeah, thanks. Seeing in the chat about the link to Eve's talk in Bristol, which I had working just like a half an hour ago. So I'll check on that, make sure that I have the right link. It's actually possible I might have cut and pasted in a sloppy way, so I'll take a look at that. But in the meantime, yeah, Frank, this is another question from our students, which is, in what ways did the Puritans' response to Hutchinson set a precedent for future conflicts over dissent, religious authority, and free speech in America?
This goes back to the question of setting perimeter, but also goes to the fact that most Puritan leaders, and not all of them, and I could make an exception to Thomas Dudley and Thomas Shepard and various others, still believed that there was further light to be found in their search for truth. Winthrop himself talked in his Christian charity sermon about how if they tried hard, that God would reveal more of his truth to them than they had ever known before. So there's a certain willingness to accept that you might not know the truth at this point. And if you look at the 1630s as a whole, there were a large number of controversies. John Endicott cutting the ensign out of the cross out of the ensign in Salem, disputes in Watertown about whether Catholics are Christians and whatnot. and they're resolved. And they're resolved either because one side persuades the other, or because in many cases, there's a willingness to say, we can't agree on this, we don't know what the truth is, but we can tolerate this difference. The big things that we focus on are not necessarily representative, but they're Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. And what makes Williams and Hutchinson extraordinary in my mind is that they are not willing to admit that they might be wrong. Anne Hutchinson comes close on a few issues during her church trial, but basically she has the courage of a conviction, and what she is saying is considered to be beyond the pale. But if you look at all of these things, there are a lot of conflicts that are resolved by agreeing to disagree. But it's also significant that there's a willingness to discuss these things, whether you end up banishing someone or not. You know, this isn't a case in which some of the leaders of Massachusetts said, this Hutchinson woman is preaching heresy. She's saying something's wrong. Lock her up, ship her out of the colony, or whatever. She is given a hearing. The Baptists in the 1640s are given a hearing. Even the Quakers who come to the colony in the 1650s are given a hearing. The results might result in imprisonment, banishment, fines, and whatnot. But there's at least the initial willingness to be open and hopefully persuade these people that they're wrong.
And if I could just add, there is a very direct relationship between these conflicts in the 1630s and our modern concept of freedom of religion and speech. And when Anne Hutchinson left Mass Bay Colony in the spring of 1638, she actually walked 60 miles to Rhode Island. She went with a group of men were supporting her because she couldn't, as a woman, couldn't purchase land or hold land or, you know, do most things. Certainly sign her name to a legal document. All these men, her family and supporters, wrote this Portsmouth Compact, which was for the community in Rhode Island. They were settling around her after her banishment. And their main goal was to create a body politic with a regular government in which all may worship God according to the dictates of conscience, unawed by civil power. So that notion of freedom of speech and religion leads directly to the Bill of Rights and the sorts of matters that we talk about in politics today. So it's very, very relevant now, these arguments they were having then, and the way people like Hutchinson and Williams changed in the new communities they created to the south.
That's powerful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Frank and Eve. James, another question from the students that maybe I'll lob your way. How do you think about the Puritans' religiosity in your work and the way that it impacts the characters, both historic and the dramatic invented characters that you created? And how do you map that on to a work of art that you're creating for a modern audience, right? Worldview, right? How do you reconcile the worldview of the time with art that you're making today, and how do you wrestle with that as a creative?
Yeah, sure. So, like looking at it as a big picture, I mean, like in a way, it's when you look at these historical things, and as an artist, I might say that like you kind of have to think, maybe I assume like a lawyer has to think a lot of times. I'm not so much taking sides as I have to make some sort of like logical argument and sort of like, you know, and in the case of religiosity, I made a very conscious decision that like you know, like there's a prerequisite for a class. My prerequisite was that basically if you had some familiarity with religion, some sort of religious practice, that this would probably at least poetically speak to you in terms of the religious things that are discussed. That was kind of the bar I was trying to hit. But to get there, I, I really, and granted, now at this point, I've, forgotten most of it. So I'm glad we have historians on the panel. But, I read source documents and did a ton of research because just understanding the antinomian controversy was a huge task. It was very difficult. And even then I didn't quite understand it. And even then, who was it? It was I've got to find, yeah, Daniel Hall, I think, says in one of the footnotes to his primary source thing, maybe some of this is lost to history. In other words, maybe, we'll never quite get all the way behind the minds of these folks. But that's where I chose some more poetic, poetic language for some of the concepts we're talking about. Like, Anne talks about the water and the blood. She talks a lot about speaking freely from a spirit. And to me, this what I tried to create in a broad sense, getting back to this lawyer idea, is the idea that I didn't want to damn Winthrop, nor did I want to vindicate Anne Hutchinson. I wanted to create a paradox of, we need both freewheeling expression and freedom and not oppression, but we also need shared values. And that's the paradox of the opera, right? That's the thing that everything has to revolve around. And so that's where I sort of landed on some of the expression I use. So a lot of times when she's talking about religion, she says things about, you know, what she personally feels. And that's an oversimplification, but I thought that would speak better to people. And Winthrop is saying, well, don't you have to follow rules, because then it'll be a free-for-all. And so, on the most basic level, I hope that people can understand that and not need to be deeply religious or even that familiar with Christianity to be able to get something out of the opera.
Mm. Well, thanks so much for that. I want to maybe lean into this idea of the paradoxes and the um, complex ways in which we remember and learn from our past, particularly here in the U.S. and in Cambridge. We're making art, making music, studying on the same land where all of this took place. You can see in my Zoom background the statue of Anne Hutchinson that is at the Massachusetts State House. And so this prompts a question that's open to all of you around memory and memorialization. So we remember John Winthrop for his aspirational vision of the city upon a hill, right? But his actions as a colonial leader, particularly concerning violence against indigenous peoples, the establishment of slavery, have come under increasing scrutiny, particularly at institutions like Harvard, where we have buildings named after many of these folks. Reckoning with the legacies of these historical figures associated with slavery, with colonial violence. How do we reconcile this aspirational rhetoric of the Puritans with the exclusionary, the violent realities of their governance? Can it even be reconciled? And really, maybe for the historians here, what role might historical scholarship play in accounting for and learning from the past through a critical lens towards coming up with some answers around how we might remember or honor or condemn or all three of those things when it comes to these figures, because these are hot conversations that are happening here at our own school and in other places around how we uplift the best of our history, but tell the truth and account for and seek a certain measure of learning, repair, and perhaps even reconciliation, if that's even possible. So that's a very long-winded question, but open to any part of it. Maybe either we could start either with Frank or Eve.
I organized some of my thoughts on this because I was asked to speak I guess it's over a year ago now, to the Harvard committee that was considering whether or not to change the name of Winthrop House. And there are a couple of things. One is, I think that in recent times, we've come to focus and exaggerate or too quickly categorize certain actions. Certainly, the war against the Pequots, whether you consider it justified or not, it was carried out in a horrific way. I might add that the governor at the time of the Pequot War beginning was not actually John Winthrop, it was Henry Vane. The law against slavery, as a number of people pointed out, recognizes slavery. It was the first law in the colonies to recognize slavery, but it also limited slavery to people captured in war, and it did not make slavery an inheritable situation so that the children of slaves were not slaves. The Massachusetts laws required slaves and all other servants and all men and women to be taught how to read. I think that you have to recognize the negative parts of the legacy of Winthrop and others. You can contextualize them, but you can still say that these are things that Winthrop himself might have considered sins if he looked at them from our perspective. On the other hand, you know, this is an individual who set out the idea that we all need to work together, to labor together, to mourn and suffer together in a common cause. They created a society in which ordinary people got to participate with annual elections, in which governors could be replaced, as Winthrop was just before the time we've been talking about, and then restored in the May 1637 elections. They created a public school system. They created laws that had to be obeyed and interpreted by judges, as opposed to judges using discretionary powers to decide whatever they wanted to decide. There are a lot of positive things we get out of this, and some of those are particularly what I've often called the Puritan social gospel, the need to help out others, to extend things to everyone in the community, which inspired reform movements down through the ages, particularly in Massachusetts. So I think it's a question that we don't want to glorify. Let me finish by using an analogy. When Oliver Cromwell, a good Puritan, was Lord Protector of England, and he was having his official portrait painted, he told the artist, a man by the name of Lely, that he wanted the artist to paint him warts and all. And I think that's what we as historians and as citizens need to do. We have to look at people, warts or all. All too often, people have written biographies that ignore the warts, but all too often, some stories only look at the warts. We need the complete picture, and I think that would help us in dealing with these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing that perspective and for the deeper context, and certainly a lot to reflect upon.
And I think also there's so much complexity, and this is our history, early history of our country, which is often ignored. Many people don't go far long before the Revolutionary War, and if they do, it's just there was some witches were hanged, and before that, some people came over from England on ships, and decades, centuries passed by in which nobody was here, nothing happened. So I think these roots of our modern principles that we're arguing over today, something like democracy, one man, one vote really comes out of the covenant of the first Boston. And that idea of one person, now it is only a landed man, a Puritan landed man, but it's one to one, and that notion has been expanded over history to include all adults and of all kinds. And it's the same idea, only expanded. So many of these conflicts they were having led to the beliefs that are honored or valued in the Constitution. And the idea, for example, the idea that people have the right to dissent. They have the right to choose as a group, and their representative democracy is beginning in this period. And also that they can file petitions and dissent. And this is, so important to us today. And you can call it good or bad. And they also were, Mass Bay Colony was enslaving Native Americans quite early on. But bad or good, this is our history. And if you can learn about these events and why they were fighting the Pequot War and who was, what they were getting from it and who was being harmed by it and how it changed their lives, you don't have to judge it, but you can see the strand from then to now. Which is, I think, what the opera is trying to do, to connect it to us.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank all of you for this rich dialogue. I want to take a moment now before opening it up to the audience to share some music, and we have a short recording that was recently made by soprano Sarah Joyce Cooper, who is playing the role of Anne Hutchinson. It's a beautiful aria. It happens near the end of the opera, entitled Unadorned. I'm going to share the text with all of you. And as I set that up, James, I don't know if you have maybe a few words to help set the scene here of this particular part of the opera.
Sure. This is right after Anne in the opera, not in real life, but has been sort of set up by Winthrop to conference with the ministers who are obviously going to, in a sense, testify against her. It's kind of like a way to win some public support in a sort of devious way. So it's right after that, and then before her last day of trial, in which everything kind of comes to a big conclusion. And so she's reflecting on what's really important to her. And I thought it was this is the only moment in which she's really by herself and the only true aria that she sings that's not with the chorus, in which she reflects on what's important to her, which I think ultimately is, her faith and her family. So.
Great. This is an excerpt of Sarah Joyce Cooper with Andrew Courtney playing the piano reduction of Unadorned. Here.
I stand before thee as plain as when I was first born. Here we rule our little kingdom from day to night and night to morn. Unadorned from our Creator, born from sin, yet born to love. Let our home be warm and tender, content with joys sent from above.
I'll pause it there just for the sake of time and to also entice hopefully some folks to see this opera that will take place at 8 p.m. on March the 1st in Sanders Theater at Harvard University. It will also be streaming live on YouTube and remaining on YouTube for a while after the opera. And you can find out more information at singatharvard.com. All right, we have some questions that have come in through the Q&A. And the first one here is for Eve from Roxy Miram, who is our stage director. It's great to have her with us tonight. And she writes, Eve, when you think of Anne as a character, especially at the time of the trial, what traits are most prominent for you based on your research and your imagination of her as your ancestor? I think you're on mute, Eve. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. I was prompted to come up with 3 words to describe her, and I came up with brilliant, courageous, and thwarted. And I think you're specifically asking about right before the trial. Is that right?
At the time of the trial.
Yeah. It's very hard to know, but I think she didn't believe that she would be banished. And so it came as a surprise. Perhaps she believed that her sex was a shield more than it really was, because it was really the problem. She also at this time was newly pregnant with what would turn out to be a hydatidiform mole, which is now basically considered a tumor that would be removed. But they didn't know what it was. And so she was probably not well. She collapsed halfway through the trial, just fell to the ground. And then she recovered and continued on. She was expected to stand through the 2 days of the trial and allowed no counsel. She performs quite brilliantly. The only reason we know she was brilliant is that we have this transcript that was saved by Winthrop and the other judges and sent to England to sort of maintain a good reputation in England, because they wanted to be shown to be doing the right thing so they could keep their charter. But so she behaved very brilliantly, but then ultimately she told them too much of the truth. She told them that yes, indeed, she was teaching men, and that was not appropriate for a woman to be doing. So it's a fascinating time, but I guess that would be my start to an answer.
Mm-hmm. James, how would you describe Anne Hutchinson in 3 words?
Wow. I think resilient would be a big one. I think persistent would be another, for sure. And then I think also, in a sense, I have to say prophetic, even though I think that when you write about when I'm writing about Winthrop and Anne Hutchinson, you kind of get tired of both and their sort of foibles and their hangups. At least as an artist, I did, and trying to make a story about it. But what was amazing to me is like she seems to see things like hundreds of years from now that will be so important to the way she's perceived as a leader. I think she viewed herself as a leader and having these talents. So I think prophetic, even though that's kind of what she was technically accused of, I think in the end, sort of, she certainly was that.
Frank, do you have 3 words in mind?
Brave, certainly. Zealous, which was a good thing for Puritans, and intolerant. And I think one of the things that comes through on this whole thing, and I would broaden the controversy to include people like Dudley and the Reverend Thomas Shepard of the First Church in Cambridge, that there's, and this has a parallel to our own time. There's an unwillingness to try to appreciate the other point of view. There's a sense of demonizing those who are opposed to you rather than trying to find some common ground. And again, for those who are interested in this, I think when you look at the church trial, which resulted in her excommunication, there are points in which there are people who are trying to reach a common ground, including Anne Hutchinson, who's willing to admit that she might have misperceived some things or been misinterpreted and whatnot. So those were those, yeah, I'm brave, zealous, and I think intolerant.
Thank you. Thank you all. James, this is a question in the chat for you from Alicia Onstead. We talk a lot about who can write about whom, this idea of cultural propriety in making art, right? What was important to you in representing a woman, especially one so far from our own experiences, but also possibly closer than we might expect to the ongoing lives of women, particularly these days?
Yeah, I think I was inspired by the story, and the fact is that I guess you couldn't find a similar story at the time that was about a man that has so much text, so much primary source, so many words that I can set to music. But I was also, as I think I said a while ago, I think I view, part of, at least, other artists are different, but I view my job as kind of like a lawyer, where when I take these stories, like I also wrote about sort of a paraphrase of Antigone and some other religious things that I've worked on. But like, I have to look at it and try to, do my best to portray both characters in a way that create an actual dramatic ambiguity and don't just condemn one and exonerate the other, because I don't think that's very good drama usually. I'm sure there's examples, but it's not a comedy, it's a tragedy. So, but I hope that I certainly did a lot of research and thought about it a lot. And I have to say that, like, on a personal note, as I was finishing it, because the hardest part was doing the score, and the parts take a really long time when you're doing this kind of work. And the thing that was really driving me, that's over and over again, I was thinking about stories of women in my family and their life stories. And I'm like, this is still reflected in what we see today. I mean, it's like the kinds of oppression and inequality, like, not being able to find the right the right plug-in in a community, in a communal setting. So that was sort of inspiring in the end as I was finishing up the project.
Thanks, James. Another question in the Q&A was Anne Hutchinson's banishment more related to her disrupting the peace or a disagreement with her beliefs? So was she seen as a threat, or was it simply a matter of theological doctrine and heresy? How do we think about the motives behind the trial, if it's even possible to fully understand, or, I mean, how can we, yeah, you want to take that one, Frank?
Well, I mean, I think the civil government, the general court, is going to banish her because they perceive that she is a threat and is prophesying against the civil government and the establishment. The church trial, which follows, is very theologically oriented, very belief oriented, and she is excommunicated. But one of the things which is characteristic of the Puritans is that they believe in a separation of church and state, in that no clergyman can hold political office. No one who is punished by the church can be deprived of political rights, but no one who is condemned by the state can suffer loss of their privileges in the church. So it's a twofold thing. and there are sort of two separate arms of authority that deal with her. There's no question but that she is very successful in trying to avoid anything that would directly connect her to sedition. Although in the background context, her supporters, including her brother-in-law, Reverend Wheelwright, had been taking steps that seemed to threaten authority. And one of the things that I thought was very well done in James's work is he makes the point, which I certainly picked up on, that because of what were essentially religious concerns, the men of Boston refused to go off to war to defend the colony, presumably against the Pequots, because John Wilson, who was one of those opposed to Anne Hutchinson, was going to be the chaplain for that militia group. And so, you know, there were evidences that this religious division could result in a threat to the civil community.
Yeah, thanks for that. We really appreciate everybody being with us tonight. I think just maybe one more time here, I'll share our concert announcement concert poster. The piece is going to be conducted by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Hannah Tsai, and will feature the Harvard Glee Club, the Radcliffe Choral Society, the Harvard Radcliffe Collegium Musicum, a professional orchestra, cast of 5 artists playing 6 roles, and over 150, 160 people on stage. This is one of, if not the most ambitious projects we've done in my time with the choruses at Harvard, and so far been a very rich experience to learn through art, to create a work of art that has come up several times tonight, certainly has resonances with our world today. And we'd love to see you in Sanders Theater if you can make it. And if not, maybe online as well. I also want to thank my colleague Olivia Parada, who's the administrative manager for choral music at Harvard and serving as the producer of the opera, which is a brand new job for all of us as choral musicians. But to James as well for his labor of love, about a decade in the making, and also so grateful to have these 2 distinguished scholars, historians, and authors with us today. So thanks again. Encourage everybody here to learn more about James's work and his compositions. Of course, Eve's text, American Jezebel, shared that YouTube link in the chat of a talk she just gave in Bristol, Rhode Island about Anne Hutchinson. And Professor Bremer's prolific author, his biography of John Winthrop is one that does allow us to learn more about his life and legacy, warts and all. And thanks everybody for being with us, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.